spent with collaborators the last few years, collecting evidence of historical collective governance practices, not dissimilar to the one that we're going to be talking about a little bit today. And so we're really thrilled to have Professor Jennings, Mills, and Feinman presenting the book today. Nathan will speak at greater length about the volume in a second, but I just wanted to spend a minute to discuss our joint project, which is of course a project sponsored by and housed in Metagov, so this seems like a proper thing to do. Our project is called Governance Archaeology. It's perhaps the pilot of a larger thing that I'm going to be talking about in a second. And it collects evidence of about 91 cases of popular government institutions from the 4th millennium BCE to the mid-20th century. We cover all continents, and we try to explore the micro-foundations of institutional design. So who has access to popular institutions, how decisions are made, and how they are enforced. So anyone who'll be interested in accessing this data, talking about it, learning more about it, should look at the fantastic website that Nathan and other collaborators have created and reach out to us in any form. From governance archaeology, a whole intellectual ecology developed. So governance ecologies is sort of like a larger umbrella project that we are working on. We're joined here by other collaborators at the University of Colorado Boulder and at Metagov. And basically, we're trying to do a similar thing. We try to push the research about collectives, about collective governance into new parts of the world through new methods. Governance ecology includes a big project on oral histories. And we try to pursue the same goal that we pursued with governance archaeology, and that I think the speakers today are also trying to pursue, which perhaps this is something to discuss, but it is trying to understand how humans collaborate and govern themselves and use this knowledge to inform conversations about institutional design and building. So I'm very excited about the conversation. I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to shut up.
Thank you, Federica. I'll just say really briefly, I encountered this book over the summer and was just really drawn in, deeply grateful for it. I was on vacation and read it as my beach read. And that's really because it takes ideas that have been swirling around, I think, our community and a lot of other communities in recent years, ideas about rethinking how we tell the history of human self-governance. The Dawn of Everything book by David Graeber and David Wengrow is an important landmark there. And in some respects, I see this book as a chance to really, really deepen that conversation. One concern I've had over the course of this exploration is are we really grounded in the best evidence that we can find? And here is a book that includes chapters written by people who've been studying each of the particular sites or civilizations or cultures or communities for their whole career or for many years. And so the depth that it provides for helping us begin to question the history, the stories that we tell ourselves is really immense. And I believe, and this is at the root of the project that Federica and I have been working on, that how we tell our history has everything to do with the possibilities of our future. I always think back to the library that started the Library of Congress. There's a display there of Jefferson's library, and it's full of all these ancient Greek books. Clearly, he was drawing on particular cases. He was drawing on other cases that weren't necessarily written in books that were around him in the Americas, but that were not often being cited or referenced. And so clearly, the making of a new governance regime was grounded in references to and imaginations derived from the past. And so this book is the kind of is just an incredible source book for beginning to think more critically and deeply about rewriting the history of governance and the possibilities for the future. I've been referring to it a lot in the book that I'm writing now on protocols and on very much tied to questions of digital governance. And I think you all will make those connections in new ways as well. So I'm going to turn it over to our three speakers today. We have the editor of the book, Justin Jennings, one of the and then two of the contributors, additionally, Barbara Mills and Gary Feinman, and they're all extraordinary people who've been working as archaeologists, developing deep knowledge in particular cultures and civilizations, presenting it to the public. In museums and in major news articles. And so I'll turn it over to them to introduce this extraordinary book to us.
Well, thank you so much, Nathan. And I guess I'll just speak on behalf of Barbara and Gary. And thank you for that kind introduction of you and Federica. And we're delighted to be here. And I'm sure they'll have their own words. We're going to have kind of a team presentation here, hopefully about 15 minutes or so, because we're very much interested in having a broad conversation with everyone here that's spending this at least from the East Coast, lunch hour with us. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here, what's always interesting.
We can see it.
You can see it. It's not ideal here in terms of. Okay. Okay. So here's an example. Here's the book right here, and basically what we're going to try to present on is trying to look at the relevance of early large-scale collectives to help improve online governance or governance in general in the contemporary world. Really this stems back, and I'm going to go through this all very briefly, but the Enlightenment Project. So if you think about the history of humanities and social sciences, it's really based on this foundation of a thought of a sort of ladder or a progress going from a state of savagery to a state of civilization. Okay. And if you look at archaeology, it's founded on these same Enlightenment ideals, and it's founded in the dash of racism that also occurred, especially in the late 19th century. And the terms changed, but basically the notion is that we are moving along this sequence of progress, of greater and greater complexity. And as the scale and complexity increased, we'd move from bands, in this case, the words have changed, but tribes to chiefdoms to states. And that states, for example, that there were certain kinds of states, and that as we moved further and further along and brought more and more groups to the apex of civilization, to state-like development, the notion was that states are going to have fairly similar forms. For example, they're going to be sedentary. They're going to be based on agriculture. They're going to have strong hierarchies. They're going to be centralized. So you had all these notions about about where we were going, that everyone is going through the same process, and that's that sort of pyramid there, that as you go through that process, the variety is going to decrease because there's only a few ways that you can actually organize that apex of state level governance. Okay, so that was that notion, and I have here this idea of the winning of the political imagination, because what happened then is that as you look at, it's kind of a weird image here, but as you looked at all the diversity across the world, what happened is that archaeologists, and this is let's say all the way up until the mid 20th century, did two things. They found the few cultures that fit within their preconceptions, and if it almost fit, they tried to tug it around to make the Maya fit or make ancient Egyptian fit, okay, and give them that state or civilization moniker. And then everything else, what they did is they simply just dismissed those oftentimes and said, well, that's a different collective. It's not quite there. It's not the quote unquote right way to organize things. So we took all this diversity, is my point, and we kind of massaged the story of a few places and made them all into states that kind of worked in similar ways. And then the rest of humanity we sort of push aside as being not state-like and not quite there and not worth sort of understanding if we want to understand what civilizations are like. And so for example, Genghis Khan, they talk about the Mongols, and one of our colleagues who was here, and I forgot to give a shout out to a few of my other colleagues from this volume that are in attendance today, and hopefully they'll they'll be able to join in the question and answers. But states' mobilities, for example, the Haudenosaunee and the confederacies, all these different ways of organizing very large, complex societies across thousands of people, were oftentimes largely ignored or weren't because they were not considered civilizations, and were not given the same care and understanding in archaeology until fairly recently. And so, what this book does is looks at case studies from around the world that both interrogates the state concept in those places that sometimes people say, oh, these are states and these are how it works, but also looks at all these other varieties of ways of different kinds of governance. How do you get large groups of people together to identify as a group, make decisions together? And we're finding a whole lot of variability. And so this book really is about that broad swath of variability of what's possible, right? Is taking that, winnowing the political imagination and widening it out, right? And so the notion here is then, can we adapt some of these past political systems to help improve governance in different ways today, be it online or offline, et cetera? And so for the rest of the talk, what we'll do is we'll have Barbara. Barbara Mills is going to give us an example here of from her own work in the American Southwest, and then Gary will end it. So I'm going to turn it over to Barbara now to continue this conversation. Barbara.
Great. Okay. Hi, everybody. It's really great to be here, and thank you all for inviting me. And thanks again to Justin for organizing this wonderful book and sessions that we had at professional meetings. My case study is based in the Chaco world, which is in this American or US Southwest. And what I'm going to talk about is kind of taking an institutional approach to the way that collective action was organized. And of course, we don't have any written records, and so all of this is from the material record. Okay. The Chaco world's monumental architecture is often considered to be prima facie evidence for large-scale collective action. And you can see major room blocks at Pueblo Bonito that were built all at once, organized at some kind of super household level. But the organization of this collective action has been much debated, with interpretations ranging from egalitarian enterprise to city-states. But as Lynn Sebastian pointed out nearly 2 decades ago, such interpretations for Chaco society are too heavily reliant on outdated models that stress centralized hierarchy, neo-evolutionary typologies, as Justin was just outlining, and dichotomies. And what they clearly do not address is who initiated the super household cooperative activities that are clearly evident in the construction of Chaco great houses and great kivas. So Lynn Sebastian drew on Susan McIntosh's book, Beyond Chieftains, an excellent book, and their work anticipated the more recent critique of social evolutionary models presented by Graeber and Wengrue in The Dawn of Everything, which is just mentioned as well. But surprisingly, Chaco or other case studies from the Southwest are absent from The Dawn of Everything. And so what we're doing in my co-author, Kelsey Hansen, and I in the book, Understanding Early Large-Scale Collectives, is to take this institutional approach to collective action, focusing on lineages, sodalities, and councils. So few would disagree that elite lineages or descent groups were central in Chaco society. The presence of 2 such elite matrilineages at Pueblo Bonito has been well established based on bioarchaeological and ancient DNA analyses. The northern burial area contained 14 related individuals in a single room, with more turquoise in it as offerings than all the rest of the Southwest put together. And Pueblo Bonito and other early great houses were constructed in the most well-watered areas of the canyon. And by establishing themselves in these key areas, we think that Pueblo Bonito's first comers likely would have gained status by attracting other migrants through their agricultural success. Following a wealth and people analogy from African ethnographies and the early dating of charismatic objects and species, such as macaws, copper bells, shell trumpets, and painted wood, suggest that ritual and public performances were also practices used to attract followers. So architectural and material culture differences show that each one of Pueblo Bonito's 2 descent groups had different networks of power. And you can see the northern cluster and the western cluster shown on this map. This diversity suggests that people migrated from different sources outside of Chaco Canyon, and based on homologous relationships to Chaco's Pueblo descendant communities, each descent group probably brought different ceremonial practices to contribute to what became a socially heterogeneous society. Key objects of ritual practice used by the two descent groups also have different spatial distributions within the building, including articulated macaws and hawks, cylinder jars, fossil shell pipes, and certain kinds of stone jewelry used in ceremonial performances. Chaco's matrilineal descent groups gained power and prestige through their ability to organize different tasks, including work groups. Large-scale grinding facilities, shown in the next slide, are adjacent to kivas and other forms of. Can we advance that slide, Justin? Let's see.
I'm trying, Barbara. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'll just keep talking.
Yeah, keep going. I apologize.
Yeah. So the next slide is one that shows a differential distribution of material goods and a macaw, which is one of the imported items. And then we also have evidence for large-scale grinding facilities. So there is ground stone that is present in the rooms adjacent to residences and to kivas, which are the ceremonial rooms. So Chaco's matrilineal descent groups probably gained power and prestige through their ability to organize cooperative tasks, including work groups. Large-scale grinding facilities, as I mentioned, point to communal food preparation. And marriages between elite families would have facilitated the cooperation of different descent groups. Such alliance building is common among elite families worldwide, but Chaco's success must also have required the involvement of families in small houses. And one of the major institutions that accomplishes this coordination, the super household mobilization, is that of sodalities. So sodalities are non-kinship-based organizations dedicated to specific tasks, such as grinding. These are metate bins. So multiple women would have been grinding together in this one room in a communal food preparation. So sodalities can include hunting, medicine, feasting, and warrior societies. Sodalities have been referred to as a keystone institution among North American indigenous societies, and they're fundamental to understanding the organization of collective action. So certain objects were likely owned by sodalities that we can identify materially. The next slide, such as painted wooden objects that served as altar furniture and performance regalia. Next slide, a cache in a kiva at Pueblo Bonito contained, among other objects, the bones and claws from species ethnographically associated with medicine societies, including those of black bears and mountain lions. In Pueblo Bonito's room 32, next slide, at least 300 ceremonial wooden sticks were found stacked in the corner. You can see that on the left, and were carved and decorated in distinctive ways that likely varied by sodality membership. So we think these were carried by people during performances. The placement of these objects in the earliest part of the building suggests that members of the northern matriline were also members, if not leaders, of one or more of these sodalities. Another indicator of sodality practices was the ritualized drinking of imported cacao in cylinder jars, shown in the next slide, hundreds of which were concentrated in the northern rooms of Pueblo Bonito, especially room 28. And this is evidence of a feasting society led by the descent group occupying the northern part of Pueblo Bonito. Sodalities were also responsible for the production of paints, the next slide, used to decorate ritual objects. Among descendant Pueblo communities, the production of paint is an act of chromatic prayer managed by ritual sodalities. And my co-author and recent PhD student, Kelsey Hansen, mapped the distribution of blue-green painted media, blue-green pigments prepared paints, and tools with traces of blue-green paint, blue-green being a very significant color in the Pueblo world. And she showed that while blue-green painted media was often stored in the northern room block, their production was in or adjacent to spaces used for ritual performances, including kivas and plazas, and that distribution shown on the next slide. And you can see where that large room block built with communal labor, cooperative labor, is where many of these paints are concentrated. Now, the Council is considered another keystone institution among North American and Indigenous societies. Council-based leadership involves consensus by leaders from multiple groups. This more collective approach to decision-making contrasts with centralized hierarchical leadership and allows the integration of different institutions. We suggested that councils, consisting of leaders of multiple lineages and sodalities, were instrumental in managing cooperative activities like architectural construction. Now, downtown Chaco Canyon had the densest concentration of monumental and public architecture in the Chaco world, shown in the next slide, including great houses, great kivas, public gathering spaces, neighborhoods of residential architecture, and infrastructural investments that may be considered public goods, such as raised plazas, staircases, roads, viewing platforms, diversion ditches, and agricultural features. Next slide. Great kivas served as community centers and likely where councils met. And one of the largest of these is Casa Rinconada, located on the south side of the canyon, not in a great house, but separated from great houses, and surrounded by a near continuous distribution of small houses, which themselves were surrounded by agricultural fields. So councils likely mobilized the labor necessary to construct these massive public structures. Next slide. As others who have studied why and how people cooperate, one major point stands out, which is the close tie between fiscal financing and cooperation. As Gary Feinman has concluded, when financing, in this case, agricultural production, is, quote, exacted from the local populace, power and voice are likely to be more distributed or shared. This is a key concept in the literature on cooperation. For those in the Chaco core, there were many benefits of cooperation. If residents of small houses were supporting architectural construction through labor and their agricultural products, they would be more deeply invested in the entire process. Another likely benefit was protection from raiding and violence, which we do know was common in the Southwest, ancestral Southwest. In Pueblo societies, warrior sodalities provided systems in which people could be mobilized for unified defense and would have been an effective means of protecting residents. Next slide. In sum, we argued that Chaco governance included multiple cooperating institutions, elite descent groups, sodalities, and councils. Rather than arguing that any one institution was dominant, we took a relational bottom-up approach that helps to break down the narrowly defined forms of governments of classic neo-evolutionary models to show how interactions between these different institutions facilitated cooperation at a scale not seen before or after in the Southwest. Okay, now it's Gary's turn. Thank you.
Hi, well, thank you, Justin and Barbara and Nathan and Federica for this opportunity. I'm very excited to be here. I will just make a few points, which I hope will lead us into discussion. A key point for me is that the past should not be presumed to have been a foreign country completely different from the present or recent times when it comes to human cooperation and governance. Human cooperation, I feel, is grounded by a paradox. On the one hand, we are all selfish, have agency, can make our own decisions. But on the other hand, we are the most cooperative species on the planet with non-kin. And that's true whether you look at the scale of our social groupings or the diversity of cooperative tasks that we can engage in. And to me, this dialectic underpins human cooperation, whether you're speaking about the past or the present. And as social networks and interactions scale upward, we do see leadership, governance, and institutions develop and diversify, but these take a whole variety of different forms. Based on the cases in Justin's volume and other studies, we see in those institutions great variability in the degree of concentrated or personalization of governing power and the extent of citizen inclusiveness that range along a continuum or axis. And those are the two real key components of the axis of concentrated power democracy or autocracy, is how much is power concentrated and how much access do people have to the operations of governance. And so we see variability in the past that matches in many ways the nature of the variability that we see in the present. Next, please. So I would view democracy and autocracy, or whatever terms you want to use, as a continuum, not as a category or a presence absence defined by a whole series of traits. They are obverse poles of that continuum, as reflected in the quotes that you see on the right. And in reference to this continuum, governance is and was not completely structurally bound or static. That is, whether one looks at ancient Rome, the pre-colonial Maya, other historical cases, or the US today, the nature of governance often varied markedly along this axis over time. Next, please. What we are finding through historical comparisons is that although scale and population do matter, it is not a deterministic factor, as Justin touched on, for defining where specific cases lie along the autocratic, collective, or democratic axis. And that means that the presumption very much embedded in neo-evolutionary thought is not holding. And here you see the results from 3 large comparative samples. And I apologize, the graphs are not completely synchronized. But they do show an important pattern, even though they measure things in slightly different ways. On the upper left is a sample of pre-colonial Mesoamerican centers that was compiled by David Carballo and me. On the right is a graph of the 30 cases in Richard Blanton and Lane Farger's sample of pre-modern states. And on the bottom left is a preliminary global sample put together by a collaborative team at 2 governance workshops held at the Amrin Foundation. Now, what's important here is that the relationship between population size and the collective autocratic axis was not even directionally consistent across these 3 samples, and that the relationship in all 3 cases was very weak and certainly not determinative. So size does not determine the concentration of power when you do comparative analyses across cases. Next, please. Likewise, based on this preliminary Amrin workshop sample, this axis of governance is not the simple consequence of geography. Neither Europe, as is often presumed, nor pre-colonial Americas, as kind of hinted at by Graeber and Wengrow, was the sole font for relatively democratic forms of governance. Rather, across time and space, there is and was variation in all 3 regions you see here for which we coded information. Next, please. So to understand the factors that prompt and the consequences that accrue in relation to variability across this dimension of governance, we need more concerted efforts to synthesize, reconceptualize, and leverage the information that we now have in our possession. There is no need or really justification to keep cherry-picking single cases to bolster outmoded models and theories, as Justin pointed to in his presentation. Productively, we are starting to see cross-time, cross-space, cross-disciplinary patterns, as Barbara mentioned, in these relationships between governance and other factors, but more comparative research clearly is needed. And as seen in Justin's volume and the discussions today, archaeology can and should be a major contributor to address the kinds of questions that are being framed today that challenge long-held, overly linear, progress-driven, and uniform narratives of humanity's past. There are lessons and warnings in the past that we can leverage. So thank you very much.
Thank you, all three of you. What a fabulous tableau you've given us, starting out with the frame and where we're coming from, going deep in a particular case, and then stepping back and looking at some of the patterns we're noticing across context. This was just phenomenal. Thank you so much. I'll be moderating the discussion. So if you don't mind using the Zoom hands, that's a good way for me to know, who actually wants to speak as opposed to just riffing in the chat. And feel free to bring up questions and comments. Just to get us started, I'll ask, if we turn toward lessons a little bit, are you seeing clusters start to form among these cases that you're looking at? I mean, you're arguing that there's not a linear trajectory in the ways that assumptions might expect, but what kinds of things do we see, patterns? Do we see civilizations around the world perhaps forming around? Are there lessons that maybe we can draw from those patterns for the design of new forms of governance?
Well, Nathan, I think
I'll take that one first, just to start us off. In North American archaeology, I think we're realizing that a lot of the forms of governance are actually shared, even at very great distances. So sodalities, for example, sometimes some of them, very restricted ones called secret societies, are present in California, and they're present in the Northeast, Iroquois, for example. Jen Birch's contribution to the book actually parallels mine in many ways in terms of taking that institutional approach. So if we start looking at these kinds of organizations, sub groups within the larger group, and then see how they're stitched together, we do see that coming out of the North American literature, at least.
Gary, did you want to add to that before we move on?
Yeah, I think there are a number of patterns. One is, I think that, as Barbara said in her presentation, how governance is financed is a really critical variable. And it seems to hold across very different samples. So that's one thing. So I think we should not separate economy and politics to the degree that there often are in our analyses. Number two, I think that there is a lot of variability even within regions. Like if I look at Mesoamerica, pre-colonial Mesoamerica, which is my principal region, the Maya in the first millennium AD had a very different organization than their neighbors in highland Mesoamerica, who they interacted with, and they even visited each other's places, in small numbers. So there's a lot of variability within regions in governance. And then, of course, over time, the post-classic Maya were not nearly as autocratic as the classic Maya were, whereas in other regions, the transition went from more collective or democratic forms to more autocratic forms. So there's a lot of variability in all the. So those are some of the points that I would make of a more general comparative nature.
Fabulous. Thanks. Federica?
Yeah, I'm going to ask the exact same question that Nathan asked, but in a slightly different way to see if we can sort of like take you farther away from your cases to essentially speak to the larger question that I think we're all interested in the audience. And of course, I think you as the authors and contributors to the volume as well, which is, so what are we learning that is new? What of this variability, what of this sort of like what in this attempt at looking at governance across the world, across scales, across time, tell us that we don't know, that tells us that in some respects the assumptions and the preconceptions and the conclusions of the empirical work that is more generally more traditional in the social sciences sort of like needs revision. Right. And so I think that it's this is the closest, Gary, the closest I have heard anyone get to the level of theory is your sort of like two core component story that you presented here, which I want to hear way more about, the power and access, I think, and imagining how like the societies could be plotted across this sort of like a table of two components. But what do you think, how far are we, I guess this is a question, from a theory of collective governance, of collectives, or collective action that is telling us something fundamentally different or new about how humans have cooperated and collaborated across time and space?
Yeah, it looks like Justin has a start.
Maybe I could speak first at Puerto Rico, because what you and Nathan have is you've kind of jumped to the $1 million question. In a way, what this volume is kind of doing is trying to lay the groundwork for more and more of that work. Because in part, what we're saying is that, hey, we have a state problem, that we have a problem and that we keep on going ahead. Just like, and I'll jump over to the Greek and Romans, that we have a polis problem, right? Is that we have an issue where we go ahead and keep on thinking that Athens tells us how everyone else worked. We're realizing that it doesn't. So we're kind of still in that initial stage. I think that certainly the work that Gary's and other people are doing are beginning to advance from that, is that we're looking at some of those bedrock assumptions and sort of saying to ourselves, hey, look, a lot of that bedrock is implicit bias. I mean, I know Nathan's talked about implicit feudalism and online governments, same thing we have here. And so what our volume is supposed to do, I think, in essence, is to say, hey, look at this rich diversity we have here, and then begin to build from that rich diversity to begin to recognize some of those patterns. So, I think Gary has some ideas. We certainly have. There's a number of great sort of projects are developing that look at things, for example, like patterns and inequality across groups. But for right now, really at the beginning, I think, of theory building and building that foundation of possibilities that we can explore them. Would be it's not a satisfying answer, but I think that's more realistically where we are right now versus being able to give you some fairly definitive answers about other possibilities. But the point is, I think that we just simply did not recognize them because we chose not to see them as viable. Now we're looking at much greater range, and now we have to sort of look at the possibilities of hey, look, there might be some broad patterns, and some of those are what Gary just mentioned.
Gary?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think that, as Justin said, I think a lot of our assumptions that are very, very deeply embedded in all of social science are more musings that have their roots in 500 years ago and just kept being amplified. Things like there were only rare cases of democracy before, let's say, 1500 AD, and they were limited to Greece and Rome, and somehow there's some unique phenomenon there. I think there's some, as Barbara pointed out, there are very distributed power arrangements going back through time in North America and Middle America and other parts of the world. So that's a really different assumption, and what it means is that the idea that somehow 400 or 500 years ago, people discovered a rationality which allowed for democracy, and then it's gotten transmitted elsewhere, that whole set of assumptions is problematic. and yet it's pretty core to what we do and how we think.
All right, we have Jennings and Alistair. Jennings first.
Yeah, I think just a little linguistic note. I think that the term democracy is more of an ideal than an actual practice. Demos is not the citizenship, is not the mob. It's actually the enlightened and informed citizens. That's why in ancient Athens, the assemblies were mandatory participation, and who didn't participate and didn't try to understand what were the public affairs was called an idiot. And I think by that token, we have idiocracy. We don't have democracy by any. We don't even have mob rule. We're even worse than that. And by invoking mob rule, I'm interested in if in the archaeological records you find any evidence of power struggle, violence. That's number one, because usually when we're power sharing, even in the smallest unit, which is the family, you do have violence in their verbal in terms of disagreement and quite often, unfortunately, physical. And I'm interested if the archaeological record has tokens of such violence. That's number one. Number two, I didn't see mentioned the existence of archives, which is really important because archiving implies kind of like a bureaucratic and nature, which of course implies a hierarchy which is going to maintain and dictate the archive. And in modern societies, there are small societies, I know for where I come from, where there is no archive and everything, every arrangement on the village, on the communal level is bespoke. And that makes the community really impervious to authoritarian, centralized power. So I'm curious if you can comment on the existence of archives and absence of in these Chaco communities. Thank you.
Barbara, do you want to take that on?
Well, I just want to point out that in North American societies that I'm most familiar with, there are no documents, and so there's no archive in the bureaucratic sense, like the Near East or Mesoamerica. But we oftentimes refer to the material assemblage, the material culture, or assemblages of artifacts as archives, as ways of that people promote memory. How things are passed down within societies. But in the Chaco example, there's definitely evidence for violence. I mentioned the 14 elite individuals who are part of one matrilineage. Both of the first two burials show evidence of trauma, and one of the two men who was buried on the floor of that room, the foundational burials we call them, one of them died of his wounds. And so we know that violence was very, very important. And that's why warrior societies or warrior sodalities, groups that are above the level of the household, are very important for understanding the level of violence and how they're organized.
I would just add that every society that I'm aware of has some evidence of violence, and I think that's a different set of circumstances than how power is distributed or not. I mean, I think it's part of that, but it's not telling one way or the other. I think there are a lot of archival information or writing in almost every or most every early civilization, with the possible exception of South America, but there they had other ways of accumulating information and transmitting it. But it's different, and the functions of those written systems are not the same by any means. So I think, and I would agree with your definition that democracy is aspirational, but so you never have rule by everyone. I mean, that just doesn't exist. So we're in agreement there. I think that what we see, even with just the archaeological record alone, is sometimes power was much more concentrated in a single individual or a small number of individuals or a single small family. And in other cases, it's clearly much more open. They're council houses, they're meeting rooms, they're more accessible places where governance took place. And that kind of information, backed up by other indicators as well, I think is what tells us that there's variability in how people govern themselves.
By the way, the term autocracy is also it's contradictory, because if you were an autocratic, you were in charge of your own self. That's the exact opposite by being ruled by a monarch. So I think we use the term autocracy wrongly, and we should regress back to using monarchy or oligarchy or totalitarian or whatever.
Alistair, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, hi. It's a bit of a tangent, but hopefully not too random. I just read a really fascinating paper on the Indus civilization, and I was just wondering if any of the speakers had any kind of connections with the work they're doing with the Indus civilization, because so many of the similar patterns seem to emerge there as well.
Well,
Yeah, I'm trying to see if
I'm not
Adam's here.
really
Is Adam here? Is Adam
Yeah,
here?
Adam here, that would be good. He might be on his way to China, I'm afraid, for a conference. There is a paper in the book, in Justin's book, by Adam Green, and he's also written a number of other articles, and I think his work very much fits in with the kinds of discussions we're having today.
But certainly, Alistair, I would say, that and I don't know, it'd be interesting for you to share maybe in the chat the article that you're speaking of.
It was that one, I think. It's Killing the Priest King.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. So so the one in the book itself, yeah. Because certainly what we're looking at is that, the collapse of different groups, for example, Chaco Canyon, the collapse there, and Barbara could talk about that certainly more eloquently, is a number of factors. Anywhere you go, it's going to be fairly complex. But what's oftentimes interesting, I think, for this group is how much of it has to do with trust, right? Is identity and trust. Is that in the end of the day, is that you think of yourself as part of something bigger than you, right? And then at what point, how does that get eroded in different ways? That oftentimes you see that trust, and you see these issues, and it's sort of very germane to today, is that it happens slowly. You don't really think much of it, then suddenly it just goes over a cliff, right? So I think there are some interesting aspects here, and then it's all these ties. And what I think was so impressive about Barbara's work is recognizing those many different ties that bind people together beyond the sort of big government, for example, that you might think about, and what happens when those sort of small world connections begin to erode. But yeah, there's very complex. I mean, how things fall apart is of course a big, complicated discussion.
We have just a couple more minutes. I don't see any more hands raised, so I have another question, if that's okay. Otherwise, if anyone wants to put their hand up, I'll defer. But one thing I wanted to ask a bit about is the conditions that shape kind of governance outcomes. You mentioned, for instance, Gary, the role of economy as shaping what governance looks like. That's certainly the case in the online economy, where we have big mega corporate platforms shaping the governance of online spaces. And then in contexts like blockchains, you have economic flows and tokens and things like that, absolutely shaping how governance is designed. I wonder if you have any thoughts about patterns you're seeing in this work around what causes a certain kind of governance design to emerge as opposed to another. Are you seeing, the kind of old story is like, well, once you have agriculture, it's going to start to look like this. Are you seeing contextual patterns like that, or are you calling for us to shake some of those more deterministic assumptions about what produces certain kinds of governance designs?
Yeah, I think a lot of the questions about did farming immediately change society? I think we're finding out it's much more complicated and much slower than that, both in terms of changes in governance and certainly towards concentration of power, that it didn't necessarily lead to concentration of power. The old argument that you had farming and some people were more productive land than others, and they concentrated the power and then they passed it on to, and government comes in to protect private property. That model may work in some cases, but it certainly doesn't work everywhere. And so agriculture does not seem to lead to immediate concentrations of power or to immediate increases in inequality in a number of comparative samples that have been analyzed. I think the key is with financing, where did governance get its resources? Did it get its resources by having to take a little bit from a lot of people, or did it get its resources by controlling some kind of pipeline or streamline, concentrated resources from a narrow source that did not involve a lot of the citizenry? And I think when it's the latter, that's when power also becomes concentrated. So concentrated external resources tends to lead to concentrated power, whereas widespread taxation, a little bit from a lot of people, I think tends to distribute power because people have the option to vote with. It's hard to collect that from many people, and they have the option to vote with their feet.
Yeah, Justin, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just, I mean, I guess in some ways build on that a little bit, but one thing that archaeologists have found over the past, let's say, a few decades is that they've really problematized this notion. If you remember, V. Gordon Childe talked about the urban revolution, right? And this notion that basically it's fairly common, almost like a phase change, that suddenly cities appear and everything changes, boom, right? The political, economic, social, everything is anew, and it moves in lockstep. And what we're often finding here is that if you look at patterns, you do have cross-cultural patterns that Gary and other people have looked at, but there's also broad historical patterns. And that, for example, the systems that are in place, people oftentimes tinker with those existing systems and try to use those to solve the new problems of having more and more people in one place. So there is a real need, because a lot of times what would happen in places in places around the world is that folks would study the states, and and other people would study the stuff before the states. But the same people sometimes weren't studying the two different folks, and so they have two different narratives that they're working with. So part of the issue that we're seeing right now is really need a greater attention that you and Frederica are talking about in terms of cross-cultural patterns, but really still a deep engagement, understanding with land, with place, with cosmologies, et cetera, because that does frame the choices that people are making as things do happen. Because we do find these structures change very, very quickly, oftentimes in the space of a generation, just as you can see today in some places. But they're using the tools of the past and trying to manage as best they can along the way. So it can be complicated, and so some of that too is a bit of a non sequitur. But that's the challenge when we try to do a lot of this broad comparison, is to make sure we're anchored in the realities of different places, right? Because those were important for those folks as they were trying to manage those transitions.
Thank you so much, Justin, Barbara, and Gary. This has been a fantastic discussion. I'm so grateful to be able to bring these communities together and these conversations together. I'll turn it over to Lee to wrap us up. But thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who participated.
I want to echo that big thanks. This was a really, really wonderful seminar presentation. I'm really grateful that you guys were able to come in, as well as for all the participation that happened, all the questions that happened. I'm just going to throw in a quick invite to the Slack. We can have an ongoing discussion. I know we didn't get to get everybody's questions. There are things popping off in Slack. And there's always more things that bubble up after time. So I'll throw in the channel there. You can join there and we'll have an ongoing thread for any other questions that bubble up. I also just want to say that we're having seminars every week, But next week, we don't actually have one scheduled. So if anybody was inspired by this and wants to schedule one, throw in a proposal into the chat, you can do that as well in the same channel that I just sent into the chat. And the week after that, we'll be hearing from David Sisan on data and how we're collectively governing it instead of sending it abroad into the world. So it seems very different moving from archaeology to data, but I think there's a lot more ties than you might think. But generally, super huge thank you to everyone here, everyone who presented. And as a last thing before we go, if everybody wants to unmute and clap for our wonderful presenters, then I will say 3, 2, 1, unmute. Thank you so much.
Thank you for attending and for the questions.
Thank you all for joining. It was really wonderful, and thank you, Lee, for running the show, and Nathan for making this happen. So lovely to see you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.